pleasure to welcome everyone to this special and consequential convening, conversation with Dr. Anthony Fauci. My name is Tim White, and I am the Chancellor of the California State University. Joining Dr. Fauci and me in the meeting today are the presidents of the Cal State's 23 campuses, as well as other members of the university's Senior Leadership Council. We are also joined this afternoon by thousands of members of the extended Cal State community and by a large public audience viewing the live stream. Again, welcome all. For those members of the public unfamiliar with the Cal State University, we are comprised of 23 campuses spanning the length and breadth of California, from Humboldt State in the north to San Diego State, 800 miles to the south, 486,000 students and 53,000 faculty and staff, and nearly 4 million alumni strong. The CSU is the nation's largest and most economically and ethnically diverse public four-year university. In fact, approximately 1 out of every 20 Americans who holds a college degree has a degree from Cal State University. Because of our scope, we bring a large and dynamically diverse audience here today. And because of our impact and influence across the state and the nation, we look forward to speaking with Dr. Fauci about how we can continue to be effective partners with our elected leaders and our public health officials, both in mitigating the virus's spread and in helping ultimately to facilitate the path back to relative normalcy on campus and off. With that, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Dr. Fauci, on behalf of the entire Cal State community, I thank you not only for joining us today, but also for your calm and steady leadership throughout the pandemic, and for being such a constant and trusted source of information and guidance at a time when constancy and clarity are needed as it's a matter of life and death. Dr. Fauci, do you have any thoughts for us before I ask you a few questions?
Well, actually, thank you. First of all, thank you, Chancellor White, for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you today. I don't really have any opening statement. I'm very anxious to hear the kinds of questions that you'll ask for me. Obviously, we are going through, and I don't think you need me to tell you this, a most extraordinary experience of historic outbreak, the impact and the likes of which we have not seen on this planet in 102 years since the pandemic of 1918. We are still struggling. There's a lot of positive things that we're looking forward to now, particularly what's going on over the last week with regard to vaccines. But we still are in the middle of an extraordinary historic challenge. So I'll be really interested in your questions. I'd be happy to engage in a dialogue with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. So as you suggest, and on a promising note, this has been a historic and long-awaited week with millions of doses of vaccines being distributed now across the country since the Pfizer vaccine received regulatory approval and the Moderna vaccine on the cusp of the same. So what are your thoughts on the effectiveness and efficiency of this initial rollout, and what are we learning that we can apply going forward and as other vaccines are added to our arsenal in the fight against this wicked coronavirus?
Well, despite all the pain and suffering that we have gone through over the last 10 to 11 months, the story of the impact of fundamental, basic, and clinical research that has led for us to be able to do something that is truly unprecedented, I think is really noteworthy for what it's going to do for the immediate situation, but also noteworthy for the future of our ability to develop vaccines quickly, effectively, for other challenges that will inevitably confront us. There's no doubt about that. Difficult to predict when that will be, but certainly just as we predicted, and I unfortunately did multiple times over the years, predict that we would be in a situation that we're in right now, this will happen again. So I think we need to just pause for a moment and take a look at what has really happened in the middle of and in the context of a historic outbreak. On the 9th of January, the Chinese put on a public database the sequence of this new coronavirus, SARS coronavirus 2. Within a day of that, our group here at the NIH used that sequence to pull out the gene or the RNA that codes for a very important protein, the spike protein, which is the predominant immunogen that you would use in a vaccine. This is the culmination of work that had been done for the previous 5 to 10 years to be able to use that new platform technology, as well as to put that particular protein in the conformation that would give maximum degree of immunogenicity, leading to a very robust response. So I described that very quickly in a half a minute. That was the result of maybe 10 years worth of work that antedated this particular public health crisis that we faced. So what happened in the ensuing months is that we went from a realization of what the particular sequence was to incorporating it into a relatively new vaccine platform technology, utilizing a whole variety of scientific advances to get into a phase 1 trial in about 65 days. The phase 3 trial started in July the 27th, and we have now 5 vaccines that have been supported and are at various stages of clinical trial, 2 of which have completed phase 3 trial, 1 of which has been given an emergency use authorization by the FDA, and people are getting vaccinated right now, even as we speak. But very soon, in the next couple of days, the second vaccine, the Moderna product, the mRNA from Moderna, has followed now the Pfizer literally by a few days. So we are now on the road to being able to really have that light at the end of the tunnel become brighter and brighter. So at the same time as we have what I call a bittersweet experience, I discussed this at the White House this morning when the vice president was ceremonially vaccinated to show support for the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine, that the bitter part of it is what you all in California are really experiencing, because if you look at the map of the country right now, today, California is being hit as hard as any state in the union, to the point where you're at the verge of, in some sections of the state, to have your healthcare system overrun with running out of beds.
Yeah.
That is the reason why you had to really resort to rather dramatic shutdown procedures. That's the bitter part. The sweet part and the light at the end of the tunnel is that as these weeks and months go by, if we hang in there, things will get better and better as we implement a vaccine over the coming months that will ultimately turn around and put this outbreak behind us. But it is going to be a very challenging few months as we get into the spring of 2021 and well into the summer. So we're really at the crossroads of an extraordinary time in our country and in the state of California, where you're really being challenged in an extraordinary way at the same time as that there really is hope that we're going to be able to get out of this.
Well, talk about a testimony to the power of university basic research to be able to have all that science in place, and appreciate what you've done to accelerate this. And Dr. Fauci, we've appreciated your advocacy for K-12 and higher education throughout the pandemic, and congratulations on being named President-elect Biden's chief medical advisor. That's welcome news to so many of us. And curious to know if you'll work with the new administration to prioritize vaccines for teachers and faculty, staff, and students to hasten that return to in-person learning and the resultant positive impact not only on the economy, but on getting these students back on track in their learning process. You know, and you may know that we were early and big in going to primarily virtual this last March, and have sustained this academic year with only less than 7% of our 80,000 courses per semester. Less than 7% are actually have an in-person component to it. So we really depopulated and followed your advice along the way, and we're grateful for that advice. But what do you think about the ability to get vaccines to the campus communities over the spring and summer?
Well, the answer, Chancellor White, to your question is when I assume my role after January the 20th as the chief medical advisor to President Biden and his team, one of the most important things that I will be pushing is exactly what you said, is making sure we act on the principle of our default position of it's extremely important to get children back into school and kept in school. And the idea of vaccinating teachers is very high up in the priority, as well as doing surveillance in the schools so that you can get a good feel for the penetration of infection, which hopefully will be continued to be low and not have to shut down every time you get a student that's infected. One of the things that we've learned in the universities that really is interesting, that if you do testing of students like before they might enter into a term and then do surveillance testing intermittently, and you do it often enough, you don't have to test people with the highly sensitive PCR test. You can do the surveillance with the rapid tests that are referred to as antigen tests, which are not as sensitive, but can give you a considerable amount of important information. So I would push, and I believe it will go that way, of making a high priority, making sure we get our schools open and safe, and also for the teachers, safe and open. That will be a very high priority.
Well, we would just encourage that it's not only the K through 12, but also the community colleges and the universities, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Across the board there, yeah. So the pandemic has disproportionately impacted people of color and has underscored many longstanding societal inequities that are so troubling. I know this is a remarkably great concern of yours, as it is of mine and the other CSU leaders that have joined us today. So sort of two interrelated questions for you, Dr. Fauci. How should the vaccine distribution framework take matters of equity into consideration? And what's the degree of confidence that sufficient people of color were adequately represented in the vaccine trials, recognizing that for any of us, we're not a monolith. People of color within that race and ethnicity have variance, obviously, around it as well. So could you comment on those two aspects?
Yes. I'm glad you asked that question, Chancellor White, because we put a lot of effort, myself personally, as well as my colleagues here at NIH, in making sure that we monitored the trials that were being implemented, particularly the Moderna trial, and we're doing it now with the Janssen trial, as well as the AstraZeneca trial, and now the Novavax trial, to make sure that as you get the tens of thousands of people enrolled, that you put in an effort, because quite frankly, in reality, it is more difficult to get minority populations, Latino, and African Americans into clinical trials, particularly clinical trials that have a major component run by the federal government because of the understandable distrust on the part of minority communities because of somewhat of a very difficult history of how they have been treated by the federal government in the context of things like medical research. So what we did is that literally on a weekly basis, every Saturday morning as the trials were going on, we got on with the leaders of the trial and the clinical trial sites and encouraged them and showed them and helped them figure out how to get minority participation. And we, to a certain degree, were quite successful. For example, in the Moderna trial, we tried to get to the 13% African American, which represents the relative proportion of African Americans in society. We almost got there. We got to about 11. In the Latinx population, which is about 18 or 18 and a half, 19% of the population, we got to 21. So we had good representation of both Latinx and African Americans, particularly in the trial that has been discussed literally yesterday, the Moderna messenger RNA trial. it's really important to get minorities represented in the trial, because when the trial is shown to be safe and effective, you can then look at the community in the eye and say, this vaccine is safe and effective in you and your people. So we've actually proven it by a scientifically based clinical trial. That's much better than saying, take the vaccine and take our word for it.
Right.
When it isn't our word, it's been scientifically proven. So that's really the situation. Now, the challenge is going to be, and this is something that we need everyone's help on, including the people on this screen, is to encourage people, now that we have 2 safe and effective vaccines. And I think in the next couple of months, I know that in the next couple of months, we're going to have even more candidate vaccines that will have shown safety and efficacy, to make sure we encourage people of all demographic groups to step forward and get vaccinated. Why do I say that? It is the only way that we're going to end this epidemic. If we get, I would say, a range from 70 to 85% of the population vaccinated, we will create an umbrella or a blanket, as it were, of herd immunity over the population, to the point that the virus is not going to have any place to go. In other words, we could essentially end this outbreak in this country as we know it and put it in the rearview mirror. If we do that, it would be a shame, and beyond a shame, it would be tragic, I think, now that we have in our hands vaccines that are 94 to 95% effective, and we don't get as many people as we possibly can to utilize that. You know, there's a difference in semantics between efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy is how good the vaccine is in a clinical trial. So you're 94 to 95% efficacious. Effectiveness means how good that vaccine is in the community.
Right.
And if we have a 94 to 95% efficacious vaccine, but we only vaccinate 40 to 50% of the people, that is not an effective vaccine program. So we need to make sure that we make that efficacy turn into effectiveness.
Well, you know, you can count on the Cal State University, the 23 campuses, to both on campus and in our communities be a very strong voice for everyone to be vaccinated as we work through the next 5, 6, 7 months, Dr. Fauci. You know, from what we've learned so far and continue to learn, and Thanksgiving obviously is driving this huge spike in America. And as you point out, here in California, it's just remarkably challenging, the health system's capacity. So what is your thoughts for Americans as Hanukkah winds down and Christmas and New Year's are approaching, in terms of celebrations and gatherings and personal conduct, and importantly for us at the university, thoughts as we return to the university to the winter term? Even though we're essentially virtual, as I mentioned, there are students and faculty and staff who will have traveled and socialized despite all the public health warnings, and doing so during this huge surge in the pandemic. When they come back to campus, what should we be particularly mindful of?
Yeah, so let me just take a broad population-based comment or two on the holiday season, and then I'll get back to what you're asking about the students. When I say we, I say myself and the CDC, sort of pleaded with the country right before Thanksgiving, as understandable as it is to want to travel, be with family, be with friends, have large gatherings. That is a very risky situation, particularly the degree of community spread that we have throughout the country, and particularly now as I speak to you in the state of California, because as much as you want to do those beautiful traditional things that all of us have done all our lives, the time to curtail that a bit, not eliminate it, but to just make sure you pay attention only necessary travel, keep the indoor gatherings of dinners to a modest size, not the 20 to 25 people at a big dinner indoors. I want to say the same thing as we approach the Christmas holidays and finish up Hanukkah. And the reason is that if we don't do that, it is very likely we're going to get what I call a surge upon a surge. We're already in a surge of cases. We don't want to stress the system more, particularly in the state of California, which is just right at that cusp of getting overrun in some areas of the state with regard to beds, be they intensive care unit beds or trained personnel. Now, getting to your question about students, again, if you have students that are going to come back on campus, each university system does it differently, but some of the success stories that I've had a role in and have seen actually get implemented is testing the students before they come back. So when they come back, they go into a dorm or they go into the campus and you know they're negative. But then throughout the year, to do surveillance testing often enough among a certain proportion of the students to get a real feel for whether or not you're having that kind of below the radar screen spread. And when you get students that are infected, to be able to take care of them in maybe a designated floor of a dorm or a dorm to get them out of circulation of the students on campus to avoid an intra-campus outbreak. That has been successful in several university systems that I've had the pleasure and the privilege to consult with and to help out. So I think we can get the students, the university students, the college students back on campus safely if we test appropriately and prudently, and then to do the surveillance testing. It becomes even easier now that we have readily available antigen tests that can give you an answer literally in 15 minutes. So the technology is going to help us out to get to where we want to be.
You know, on our campuses, we've done very well on campus, but a few of the places we've had the trouble off campus with where the university doesn't quite control students that live in apartments or some of the Greek communities. And so the campuses have had their hands full on the off-campus residents. But speaking of presidents, let me turn to four of them who have a question each for you. The first is Dr. Adela De La Torre. She's the president of San Diego State University. Adela?
Thank you, Tim. As institutions of higher learning, San Diego State and the CSU stand for the rigorous and objective pursuit of scientific truth and knowledge. What can California's education systems more broadly, from K through 16, do better to break down resistance to or suspicion of science and to build trust in those scientific and medical institutions worthy of our trust?
You know, that's a question. Thank you for that question. That's a question that I get asked so often, and there really is not an easy answer to that because of a lot of the skepticism about science and sometimes the outright anti-science feeling. My approach to that is to not be confrontative when you're trying to talk to somebody about the value of science, in the sense of making them feel that they have no idea what they're talking about, because that is an easy way to push them further away from appreciating that. But to explain in simple terms, knowing your audience and knowing what your message is, of just looking at the data. I think most people who feel that way do have a degree of being reasonable. They may not agree with you, but they are at least reasonable. And if you look at and point out to them examples of the important fruits of science and what science has brought to us, I think that we can convince a substantial proportion of the people who, for one reason or other, have established an anti-science approach, that we can win them back. I believe the association of science with some sort of authority is really been bad for both. I mean, I've sensed in the pushback of the things that I've tried to do to get the public health message across, is that people don't like to be told what it is to do. They seem to have a pushback on any authority telling them what to do. And somehow science, because of the fact that science is the pursuit of truth and data and evidence, sometimes takes a little bit of an authoritative look at things. So we've got to kind of make it more friendly to people as opposed to authoritative to people. Again, it's not going to be an easy task, but I found some success in doing that.
Very, very sage advice, Dr. Fauci. President Leroy Marishta leads the Cal State East Bay campus. President Marishta, do you have a question for Dr. Fauci?
Yes, I do. Thank you for your sustained and consistent leadership, Dr. Fauci. You did speak to, as our students come back, particularly if they live in the residence halls and they live on campus. The CSU, most of our students commute to campus. They live with their families in our communities, or they commute via vehicle to our campuses. So we have a lot of commuters. So what could we do in terms of really trying to control the pandemic amongst those types of students versus what you had suggested we already could do on our residential students? And also more broadly, what do you foresee how we're going to come into the 21-22 academic year given the vaccine and other types of things, and how we might be able to approach that?
Let me answer your second question first, because that's the happy news. the answer to your first question is not so easy. So if we indeed get the relative proportion of people that I referred to vaccinated, and we do it in an efficient way, like I say, I can project that between now and March, we can get the people with the high priorities, those who have essential positions, those who are elderly and have underlying conditions. When you get to March and April, we'll say April, then I would call that, more like open season. Anyone, even those who have no underlying conditions, don't have any particular reason to get vaccinated, to start getting them vaccinated. If we do that efficiently and the doses of vaccine come in according to the contractual arrangements that we have, that by the time we get to April, May, June, July, August, we can get the overwhelming majority of the people in this country vaccinated, so that by the time we get to the 2021-2022 term, I think we could be in good shape. So I am cautiously optimistic that we can do that and get back to some form of normality. Now, the question you asked about what do you do about students who essentially are in the community? They're not in the enclosed, somewhat protective cocoon of a campus. They're in the community. So the only thing I can say about that is to try and get the level of infection in the community down by doing some of the public health measures that we talk about. And those are the things that you've heard me likely say over and over again: uniform wearing of masks, keeping physical distance, avoiding congregate settings where you have crowds where you're going to be indoors and people, in fact, are going to be close to each other. So probably wearing a mask is the most important thing to do. I think that the answer to the question, my first question, is going to be the answer to the more difficult one. If we can get people vaccinated, you're not going to have to worry about the rather challenging situation you are faced with when you have people who are really commuting and not really residents.
Yeah, it's a big concern of ours, and so thank you for that. President Diane Harrison leads the Cal State University Northridge, one of our largest campuses in terms of enrollment, and it's located in Los Angeles' San Fernando Valley. Diane?
Yes, first, Dr. Fauci, thank you for your decades of public service. We're so appreciative. So much attention has been focused on the current surge and the various vaccines, but also of great significance in the short and intermediate term is the development and approval of effective new therapeutics. What can you share with us in this regard?
Great question, but that is an area that has not nearly been as successful as the arena of vaccinology, which has been, like, thus far overwhelmingly successful. So let me tell you where we stand. There are therapies for people with advanced disease, namely those who are in the hospital, some requiring intensive care, others requiring ventilators. The use of anti-inflammatory drugs like dexamethasone or some of the more highly specific have dramatically diminished the mortality rate of people who get to advanced disease. What we must do better with, and we are putting a major effort in testing, are what you do early in the course of disease, namely someone who's infected, has symptoms, but then progresses on to more severe disease. How do you prevent a susceptible person, be it a normal, healthy person, or more likely an elderly individual or someone with an underlying condition, to go from moderate symptoms to requiring intensive care? And that is by attacking the virus early on. So what have we been testing? We've been testing monoclonal antibodies, which are antibodies that you develop from an individual who has either been vaccinated or infected, and you grow out their cells and you get copious amounts of antibodies and passively transfusing them. Several of these candidates have gotten emergency use authorization. They're not fully approved yet, but they're available for emergency use. We've got to develop more of these, and we've got to give them earlier. Other is convalescent plasma, hyperimmune globulin. But the thing that we really do need to do is make a major investment in the targeted development of antivirals, very similar to what we did with HIV. The only trouble is, with HIV and with hepatitis B, C, we developed spectacularly effective drugs, but it took a few years to do it. So right now, we need to make a commitment that we're going to need those drugs, so we should start developing them right now with targeted antiviral therapy. Bottom line is, things look really good with vaccines, but not nearly as good with therapy.
Thank you.
Can the NIH redirect resources for that, or is this going to require some congressional action?
No, we are going to be making major investment in resources. In fact, we had a considerable generosity on the part of the Congress to give a supplemental emergency COVID funding. It turns out it's not part of the base research, so it's one-time money.
Right.
What we really do need, and I hope we get it with the second consideration of a relief bill, is what we do need is we need to put an additional amount, probably to the tune of $1.4 billion over a period of time, to developing targeted antiviral drugs. So we're asking the Congress, as you know, they're deliberating now. Hopefully they deliberate to the point of getting something done.
We've been leaning on the leaders because two of them are from California. So
yeah, well, the ones from California are indeed the leaders.
Yeah. Tom Jackson is the president of Humboldt State. Humboldt is California's northernmost university along the coast in Redwood Forest, sort of paradise, if you will. President Jackson?
Thanks, Chancellor. Dr. Fauci, you have modeled extraordinary leadership during challenging times. On occasion, it may have appeared that your efforts were perhaps undermined or misunderstood. For our students and for everyone listening, what have you learned about leadership through this experience?
Well, that's a great question. One of the things that is clear, I wouldn't say I learned it from this experience, but I confirmed it with this experience, because we had similar situations dealing with HIV in the 1980s and other challenges to public health, is that you have to, when you're leading, you have to lead by example, and you have to be consistent. I think if you are a leader, and I think I know because I've lived this for decades now, if you're going to be a leader, that means that people are going to be following you. In order to follow you effectively, you've got to be crystal clear in what your goal is, and you've got to articulate that goal so everybody knows where you want to go and how you want to get there. You want to get the best people, the best talent, the people who are really, hopefully, smarter than you are, and you need to point them in the right direction. And then, as I always say, make sure your agenda and your goal and your vision is crystal clear in their mind. Because if you were chosen as a leader to do something, it's because someone or some group felt that you're going to get us to a goal. If the people who you're leading are not quite sure or clear where you want to go, then by definition, you're not a very good leader. They need to really understand where you want to take them, and you need to articulate that and lead by example. If you do that, leadership in many respects just essentially works on its own. It's just a force of its own. So that's what I've tried to do over the years, and I believe it's worked pretty well.
Yeah, you've been a very impressive leader, Dr. Fauci. You know, unfortunately, we're approaching the end of our 45 minutes together, and I know we have questions that can fill up the rest of your afternoon and ours as well. But let me, before closing, just let you know how proud I am as Chancellor of the students of the California State University and for our faculty and staff. You know, where the teaching and learning experience is much different now than it was a year ago. And it's different than what our folks have signed up for. But they have shown really remarkable resolve and adaptability and grit. In fact, you know, we had our largest graduating class in the history of the university last June and our largest student body this fall. And our student success measures are stronger than they've ever been. So what message from you, from the perch that you bring to America, would you have for our students at this time when we can see and realize that light at the end of the tunnel, it's sunshine. It's not a freight train bearing down on us, but it's a brighter future. Yet that moment remains several months away for our students and our employees. What would you like to deliver to them by way of message, Dr. Fauci?
Yeah, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that. These are such unusual, trying times that we would love to see, and I have faith, you know, abiding faith that our young people in our country and your students at all of the Cal State University campuses can reach down, deep down, and just pull out the best of themselves to realize that they are unique because they're living through something that is quite historic. And if they come out of this, which they will, I have real faith in our young people, will come out with them with renewed strength that they could get through something that is historic in proportion that generations have not had the opportunity to experience. You're right. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and they've got to realize that they need to hang in there and hang in there together. I mean, we are all in this together. They need to realize when they look around at the person next to them, or they look around at the campus that's up in the north by Humboldt or down south by San Diego State, we're all in it together. And if they realize that, we could pull together and get through it. And when this is all over, and it will end, the students have to realize this will end and we will get back to normality. We'll have learned lessons, but we will get back to normality. They could look back on this and say, you know, I've been through it and I got through it. And I think at the end of it, you're going to have a whole lot of 486,000 stronger students if you do that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, very inspiring. I share your belief and faith in our students and in our future. I mean, there are headwinds out there today, but it's going to be bright and fine. You know, Dr. Fauci, I want to thank you. You've been generous with your time with us today, and I know that your time is in such understandably high demand. So thank you also for the frank and thoughtful answers to our questions, but also to those that you get posed by others that we're able to watch through the media. And so on behalf of the California State University, please accept our deepest gratitude and appreciation for all that you have done and will continue to do for our nation through this historic moment in time. And also please, if you would, to allow us to wish you an early but heartfelt happy birthday next week. And I wish all of you a safe and happy holidays. And that concludes our program. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much, sir. Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
You bet. Take good care of yourself now. Thank you.
You too. Thanks.